Now, talking about race and racism can be awkward and uncomfortable, but it is necessary to help us move forward and find solutions. So we asked our relationship expert, Dr. Karen Gordon, for some advice on how to have these difficult conversations. Hey, Karen.
Tracy, thank you so much, not only for inviting me to this conversation, but thank you to Cityline for having this conversation, because it is such a crucial conversation. So yes, let's start with a little bit of research, just so we know what we're talking about. Harvard University has found that when Black and Asians whitened their resumes, they got more callbacks from interviews. Just think about that for a second. That's pretty scary. More research from Business Insider said that 3/4 of white employees have non-white friends. Now, this is a problem because a lot of organizations look to recruiting, and so if most of your friends are white, that's going to obviously really limit many people. This one is really interesting. This comes out of Stanford, and they have found that research that highlights race are extremely rare, almost absent from psychological publications, and when it is discussed, it is authored and edited by white scholars. So start thinking about just how much whiteness there is and how that is benefiting one group of people and really eliminating others. So it's interesting to kind of start getting this data, and again, why we have to kind of enter into this conversation.
It is an eye-opener, Karen. So your first tip is understand racial conditioning. What do you mean by that?
This is a really important piece when we're kind of talking about race. It's called racial conditioning. So some of you might have heard of Peggy McIntosh. She's a white anti-racist activist, and she wrote the amazing essay. And here's what she said. Here's an important quote. "I was taught to see racism only as individual acts of meanness, not in invincible systems conferring dominance on my group." I certainly can relate to that. I would have seen racism as like, I'm going to make sure that I'm kind to all people. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. It is really important when we're talking about race that we kind of take a step back and look at the broader picture. And then she goes into one of her essays, her famous essay, "The White Privilege: Unpacking the Invincible Knapsack." She asks questions for all of us. Okay, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I'm not going to be followed, or I can go home from meetings, making sure that I belong and I'm connected, I'm not isolated, or I can turn the television on to the front page of a paper and see people that are, like me, that are well represented. And what happens is white people consciously or unconsciously learn, I belong, I matter, my voice is important, I'm special, I'm safe, I'm deserving. Okay, because of all these things that are happening around us. Many Black and people of color, consciously or unconsciously, are told, I don't belong, I don't matter, my voice is not important, I'm not safe, and I'm inferior. And so all of this is happening, this racial conditioning. And for those of you who are white, like myself, we have never probably even thought of racial conditioning before, which only shows the privilege that we've actually had. And so it's very important. I think when we're talking about race, the first step for all of us is to start being aware of this racial conditioning, and then we can kind of start leaning into more conversations around the topic of race.
So your next tip is change the racism question. And what do you mean by this one, Karen?
So we have to change the racism question from this binary yes and no, like, are you a racist? And of course, everybody kind of gets defensive. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. We got to change. We got to let go of that question. That is completely a terrible question. We've got to change it to how. How am I allowing racism to function in my family life? How am I allowing racism to function in my business? So for example, in my personal life, how am I allowing it to function? Am I only watching movies from white producers? Am I only reading books from white authors? Am I only learning about white history? That is what we're doing, is we're kind of highlighting systemic racism. We've got to kind of take a step back and ask ourselves, okay, how am I allowing it to happen? Even in the workplace, ask yourself, look at the senior leadership team in your organization. What percentage are white versus Black and people of color? We want to start kind of widening the lens on this and having a broader conversation about racism. So it's really important to change the racism question to how, not are you.
And this leads beautifully into your next tip, which is to surround yourself with diversity at home and at work.
Diversity, we need it. We absolutely need diversity in our personal life. We need it in professional life, because if we don't have it, we're missing out. If we don't have it, we're missing out on voices. Consistently, research shows that organizations that have more diversity actually perform better. Why is that? Because when you have diversity at the table, you can actually hear different perspectives. The racial conditioning, great question. Like, if I'm only hanging out with white people, I'm not going to learn about racial conditioning. If I have diversity at my dining room table or my boardroom table, I'm going to hear those voices. So it's really important that we make sure we have diversity.
Your last tip is such an important one, and I feel like it's a really good thing to start you off, and it is get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. I can't state that enough.
Yes. Yes. You know, so when people say, oh, it's uncomfortable, I'm like, yes. All progress is because we have entered an uncomfortable stage. Make decisions based on values and principles, not by your emotion. So if I value equality, if I value all people, it is important for me to really kind of enter into this conversation. Will I feel uncomfortable? Yes, of course. That's kind of part of it. So don't let comfort decide on whether or not you're going to have this conversation. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it is such an important conversation to have.
Dr. Karen Gordon, I have loved following you on this journey and seeing you be so transparent on the show and on all of your social media platforms. Thank you. Continue these conversations in your communities, because you know what? We love to see it. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Trace.